Hi there. It is time, you guessed it, for another episode of the Gracious Guest Show. And I am your host, Mike Creevy, excited to have another opportunity to share with you, wherever you are, whoever you are, however you are listening to this show, whether you found it over iTunes, Pocket Casts, Podbean, what are some other ones? Stitcher? I think that's a thing. I don't know if I'm on there or not, but there's a lot of different ways to get this program. And however you're tuning in, I'm happy you've taken some time out of your day to do so. This episode is part 2 of a two-part episode, or two-part series, rather, I should say, on the greatest trip I ever took. And as I mentioned in the last episode, a while back, in one of my first, I don't remember which, I think it was episode like 12 or somewhere in there, or the early teens for sure. You can go back and check the feed for sure and find it. I hinted at, this particular trip, and I kind of looked at it in a, like a 35,000 foot kind of flyover, and just a real quick sketch of it in general, and mentioned that I wanted to do shows in the future where I went in a little bit more depth. So that's what this is really all about. And I must say, I've been really chomping at the bit to do this follow-up to the last more in-depth episode on the first half of that particular trip, and haven't been able to, because I'm recording this right now in late August, and we just started school again. So, the high school that I work at, we're, back in it and full steam ahead, and it's always a very crazy time of year, as anyone who's ever taught knows. And even if you've never taught, if you've ever gone to school, you remember what it's like. And I can tell you, it's not a whole lot different from the teacher's perspective, except that we have more work to do than the students do, and a lot more. So anyways, it's good to be back, and I'm excited to share with you part 2 here. And so if you haven't heard part 1, I recommend you stop right now and go back and listen to the last episode, and then pick up with this one. And unless I'm terribly mistaken on my numbering, you'd be looking for episode 31, this is episode 32, dealing with the greatest trip which I ever took, which was actually a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So where I left off in the last episode was I discussed more in depth the first part of the pilgrimage, where we went to Greece and all throughout Turkey on our ship, the Crystal. And to continue on with that, and we were basically making port, or, sort of going around the Mediterranean, and we'd make port, we'd go in during the day and go and visit all these sites that have, tremendous significance for Christians, really, in a particular way. And in some cases, very, very specific importance for Catholics, in terms of the lives of the saints, the early Christians and those who learned from Christ and then passed that faith on to the next generation and beyond. So, but I want to pick up in today's episode talking about Israel and Egypt, and it's hard to pick which part of this trip was my favorite, but Israel clearly, in a lot of ways you could say has the most spiritual significance overall. And then Egypt perhaps had some of the most interesting historical significance, in a lot of ways, just because of what we got to see. So it was, again, it was like, I think it was about a 12-day pilgrimage, and this was back in 2009. It was my brother and I that we went with Steve Ray, Catholic apologist, and his group. And Steve and his wife Janet are, as I mentioned in the last episode, expert Holy Land guides. They go, probably 10 times a year for decades, and it's just crazy. So, you go there, they know everybody, they know where to go, they know where all the sites are, which marketplaces to avoid, all those kinds of really important things. And, we were the tour group of about 120 people or so, most of whom were, middle-aged, some retirees, who were there. And my brother and I were the youngest people, except for, I think there were 2 sisters, that were with their parents, and they were in their teens, or they were tweeners. But other than them, we were the oldest people there kind of independently, or the youngest, rather, people that were there independently. So when we left Turkey, then the next morning we docked in the north of Israel, in Haifa, and my brother and I were immediately flagged. I don't know, we looked kind of scraggly. We were off duty for the army, so we kind of let our beards grow and stuff, and I don't know if we got, profiled or what, but everywhere we went in Israel, they pulled us out of the line to search us. It might have just been because most other people in our group were, didn't look threatening, and maybe we did. I don't know. So that was kind of funny. And then we met up with our buses, it was 3 Palestinian Christian brothers, which was kind of cool. That were the bus drivers, and our tour guide our driver was named Afif, and our tour guide was Amer. And these are guys who Amer is actually from Nazareth, which was cool, and that's one of the first places we went. But before we did that, we drove overland, and we headed to Caesarea, which had been the provincial capital in the north, the provincial capital at the time of Christ, and that's really where Pontius Pilate and Herod actually spent most of their time through the year. And they really only went to Jerusalem, apparently, for the feast, because of all the pilgrims that would come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And there were some estimates that, typically Jerusalem was kind of this backwater sort of place at that point. It wasn't really an influential place from the Roman perspective. They were more interested in the coast, in Caesarea. And Jerusalem, I've seen some estimates. I'm not an expert on this, but some estimates that say that come Passover time, however, there could be upwards of close to hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of total people coming through Jerusalem from all over the world. Jews of the diaspora coming back, to worship at that time of year for the feast. So in Caesarea, though, it was really cool. We got to see the ruins of Pilate's house. He had basically a pool that, this lower terrace area that kind of would let the Mediterranean kind of come into it and fill up, and so it was really neat to see the ruins. And right next to it was the old hippodrome, where they would have races and that kind of stuff. And there was even the sort of casting of an old tablet. The tablet itself, I think, is in a museum, obviously, that they found not too long ago. That basically says something to the effect of, very clearly on it. We have a picture of it. You can, in parts sort of are broken away, but you can make out, Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea, Caesar Tiberius, that kind of right on it. And which is interesting because it was sort of the vogue thing for a long time in biblical scholarship to just kind of write off the existence of Pilate altogether. Like, well, he's just a literary device, and, he wasn't really real. But, we hung out at the literary device's home for quite some time and checked it out, and, found these, saw these tablets that they had on Earth that clearly say that, he was there and he lived there. So, yeah, it was just neat. Yet another of the ever-increasing amount of archaeological verifications of things in the Bible, which is pretty cool. So, we did that. There were a lot of Crusade-era structures there as well, which were kind of neat to see because they're really old as well. Not as old as the other stuff, but anyway, that was really cool. And then, so we left Caesarea and we headed to Nazareth. And that, of course, was an incredible experience to actually, see as you go, what the terrain looks like, how it doesn't look like the Bible movies oftentimes do, at least the old ones do. Newer ones are a little more sort of attuned to this, trying to make it look more accurate. But, a lot of those old Bible movies were all filmed in Southern California, and it's very desert and rocky and all that. And, the north, you figure it's part of the Fertile Crescent, so a lot of Israel is very fertile, and very green. There's forests, and I never really thought much about Jesus walking through forests. I tend to think of him wandering through the desert, and it's not always really the case. So Nazareth itself is neat, and they said that the name is kind of hard to figure out exactly where it comes from, but I think the predominant theory seems to be that it comes from Netzer, which has this idea of the blossom, or the bloom rather, at the center of a flower. And there's these hills that kind of go off in all different directions from Nazareth, almost like spokes of a wheel, and Nazareth's kind of the center, and then these other hills are almost like petals around the center of this flower. So it has that kind of connotation. And they told us that at the time when Jesus would have lived there, as best they can estimate, there were maybe only 200 or so people who lived there. It was a very tiny village, very insignificant. We think of in the New Testament when Philip and Bartholomew were talking, Philip goes to get Nathaniel, or Bartholomew, same guy, and to come see Jesus, and says he's from Nazareth. And there's that famous line, Nathaniel in John's Gospel, he's like, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" There's this kind of attitude even among the first apostles, Nazareth, okay. So it's interesting because we learned a little bit about kind of why that attitude was. They're very simple, but it was so cool. And I mean, the current city there's over, at least at this time, there were like 80,000 people that live there now. So it's a, kind of a more of a modern city, but you can still kind of get a feel for the layout of it. We got to visit the church that is built over the site that has, for centuries been reported to be the place where Mary received, the vision of Gabriel coming to her and telling her about this great calling to be the mother of Jesus. And so it was really, really just cool to be there and to kind of meet local Christians too, who like that's their parish church. The Catholic church we went to, that's where they go every Sunday, is this church built right there. So that put it in perspective. One really cool thing at that church, the Church of the Annunciation, was when you go downstairs in the lower kind of, not catacombs, but it's like a lower church downstairs, there's a phrase etched into the altar there, which comes, it's neat. It relates to John's Gospel, where it's talking about the Word, being made flesh, the incarnation, that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. What's neat is in Latin, that phrase is verbum caro factum est. In other words, literally like word flesh made was. It's kind of not the order that we're used to, but the Word was made flesh. What's so cool is this is the one place in the world that can boast this, so they have it etched in the altar. To be a little more specific, it says verbum caro hic factum est, which means, and the Word was made flesh here. And that's just really powerful as you're kneeling there in prayer, this is where that happened. The moment that Jesus was conceived in Mary's womb, the moment that happened, the Word was made flesh right there in her womb. So that was really cool. So after we went to Mass there together, we went not too far away to Cana in Galilee, to the church that's again built on the site of where the wedding feast traditionally was, where Jesus performed his first miracle, and we got to see some of the stone jars like they describe in the gospel story for purification. They're huge, like these I forget how many gallons, maybe 30, 40 gallons or something like that. I might be off on that, maybe 20 gallons, but they're big, so there were fragments of these jars that were, in some cases, like, maybe chest high, or at least waist high up to chest high, and, probably a good, 14 or 16 or so inches across, So they these big stone jars, and just imagine Jesus turning them, the water in them into wine was so cool. And the couples, it was so cool. The married couples on our tour guide, or on our tour group rather, while we were there, got to renew their wedding vows there. One of the priests that was with us officiated over that, and that was really, really special to see that. And then as we left, the only gripe, or not gripe, but the only disappointment really my brother and I had for the Israel portion of this pilgrimage was that we just only had 3 days to go through Israel, totally. So there's so much we didn't get to see. We didn't get to go to the Sea of Galilee or really spend time in Capernaum where Jesus lived during his, the first phase of his ministry. So, we always, we want to go back someday, get to go to some of those other sites, but we're very thankful for what we did get to see. So that night on the way back to the ship, we actually passed by, and you could see it in the distance, Mount Tabor, where Jesus was transfigured. He goes up on the mountain with James and Peter and John, and so we got to see it from afar. Didn't get to go up it, but that was really cool. So that night we disembarked again, and then headed down to I believe it was Ashdod, I think, in southern Israel, and got there the next morning. So we went from Haifa down to Ashdod, and then Joe and I were searched again when we got off the boat. Sure enough, and that kept happening. So this was the second day in Israel, and this day we basically spent the first part of the day in Bethlehem, and then in the evening we went to just sort of the outskirts of Jerusalem. Then that night we went back, to our ship and just spent the night in harbor, and then came back in again the third day to actually go all through Jerusalem in a little bit more depth. So that was the third day. But back to the second day there, we went to Bethlehem in the morning, and we, which, it's in the West Bank, so we had to go through, extra security. It's part of, Palestinian territory and everything. And I had forgotten to mention that on my security clearance stuff beforehand because I was still in the Army. So was Joe. So that was not on my passport, unfortunately. But anyways, that wasn't a problem in the end of it. But we went to Bethlehem, and we went to the place called Shepherd's Fields, and it's this church dedicated to that part of the Christmas story, when the angels appeared in the heavens and announced to the shepherds down in the fields the birth of Christ, and this sort of church, and we had an outdoor mass there. It was so beautiful, and it's one of these special sites, and this is kind of rare, but in the Catholic Church, there's some special sites because of their very privileged kind of historical significance or something, will have like a perpetual celebration. So, the Catholic calendar is a little bit different each day. There's always different readings. It's you read through most of the entire Bible over the reading cycle, so you kind of get this very rich experience of Scripture at the Mass all the time. And the Catholic Mass is loaded with Scripture, from beginning to end. But at this spot, no matter what day of the year it is, they always have the same liturgy, and it's the one where they have the readings about, the angels announcing to the shepherds the birth of Christ, and that's just kind of cool. So it's always this celebration of that. And Joe and I were asked to do the readings at the Mass, so we did the readings, and it was very touching. We got choked up, honestly, there. It was just a very special thing. And then, of course, as we left, there was this, kind of local guy, this, trying to sell recorders, and he was playing A Little Town of Bethlehem on one of them. It was just kind of funny. So we're there in like March, but it's like hot out, and it's all Christmas all the time there. So we hung out there. Then we went to the main event really in Bethlehem, which was to go to the Church of the Nativity, which is built over the actual site of Christ's birth. So in other words, at the time, it was just this kind of cave manger where they kept the animals. And then as the centuries passed, they would venerate these sites. Christians would come back to these sites like, hey, where was he born? Oh, over there, okay. So that was preserved and passed down through the centuries, and eventually, a church was built on the site. So, you go there today, you can't, there's nothing about it that's like, oh yeah, this was, it doesn't look like the Christmas story, but that's because, 2,000 years have happened. So all of that is underneath all this stuff, just like even in our country, which isn't that old. There's some places you go and you tour, and there's like these ruins or, an old subway station or something people didn't know was there. Like that happens pretty easily, for that to be forgotten. But the Christians preserved these sites, and what's interesting is the Church of the Nativity is one of the oldest churches in the world, because when the Persians came through in the, I think, 500s, through the area, and they destroyed and ransacked a lot of churches, they got to the Church of the Nativity, and they saw there's this etching over the door that depicts the three wise men coming to see Jesus, bearing their gifts, but there are these three guys in Persian garb etched in there. And the Persian soldiers who got there saw that, and they didn't really know what the building was, and they just thought, well, there's Persians on it, it must be all right. So they left it alone. So this twist of just, you just get twist of fate or divine intervention, preserved the church. And it had some damage over the years, was repaired, and, here and there. So there are parts of it that are newer than others, but there are parts of it, like the part of the mosaic floor, you can see underneath the main floor when you walk in, there's like a barn door almost in the floor that's open and then roped off, so you're going to fall into it, and you look down like 2 feet beneath it, and you can still see some of the original Byzantine mosaic tile, which is like 1,700 years old, and that was just really cool. And I'm a history buff in addition to a religion buff, so it was just really awesome to just be there. And then ultimately, you go up to the main area of the church, and you go downstairs under the high altar, and underneath, there's this carved out area where it's all built up around the cave that was originally there, and there's an altar down in this little chapel, and you go underneath it, and there's a hole in the ground that has this beautiful star painted around it, emblematic of following the star to Christ, and you reach down, and you can reach down about 6 or 7 inches through the hole and touch the rock face that the whole church is built on top of, and actually touch the stone floor of the cave that Christ was born in. And it's just like, I can't possibly describe, the chills you get, in a sense, like the spiritual power of being in this place where this incredible event happened, And, yes, you can pray to God anywhere, and God is with us anywhere we go, but there is something very special, though, about going to some of these specific places, and God definitely wants us, I think, to experience, when we're able to go to these places, that special connection to these stories. And you never read these Bible stories the same way once you've been there, because, that's what that's like there, or I can imagine that. So after that, we left the Church of the Nativity, then we headed out of Bethlehem down to the Kidron Valley, which goes around, you go past Gehenna. And it was funny because that's, it was the garbage pit, where they burned all their trash, and it was just this disgusting place that was a garbage pit built on top of where the previous owners of Jerusalem had done child sacrificing and all this horrific stuff. And the Israelites, when they took over Jerusalem, basically as a sign of this is this horrendous area that has been completely defiled forever, that became their garbage dump, essentially. And that's the image Jesus most commonly used for hell, which he used a lot. And but now it's funny, this is thousands of years later, now it's like been fixed up, and it's like this nice park. There were, young people on dates, like having picnics and stuff, and like families like throwing frisbees. And we were just laughing, we're like, yeah, we just went through hell. It doesn't look so bad now, but, and you go around the sort of, around Gehenna and the Kidron Valley, and then you come up to the base of the Mount of Olives, which is on the eastern side of Jerusalem. It's basically the next hill over, and that is where the Garden of Gethsemane was, at the base of that hill. And there's a church there, a relatively new church. It was only built, I think, in the 1920s after World War I, with a lot of financial contributions from people all around the world. And so inside that church, there's really beautiful like plaques all around for each, the countries that contributed, just to kind of, give them a thank you. So this church is built basically right at the foot of the mountain, right around the Garden of Gethsemane. And there's still probably good, 10 or so olive trees there, massive olive trees that have root systems that go back to the time of Christ. Now, that whole area was wrecked by the Romans a couple decades after Jesus' time, but some of those trees, are go back to that night, when he was there and prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that was a really powerful experience. And to kind of imagine, standing there and I'm thinking about it, and it's getting dark out, and we were able to really put ourselves in the mindset of, what was it like that night here with your friends, and they slept and you were praying, oh Lord, and then inside the church, again, one of these deals where it's built up over a specific site, there was a rock that the altar is kind of built out of, which is really cool. It's like incorporated into the altar. That is the rock traditionally that Jesus, prayed at when he sweat blood and everything. So that was incredible. And so we left that night, came back in the next day, back into Jerusalem. We went to the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, the only remaining part that's left from the original Temple Mount, after the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD, a couple decades after Christ's earthly ministry. And it's, you see the Wailing Wall on TV and in movies and stuff, and it's just so powerful to be there and, touch that and be present there. There were a bunch of bar mitzvahs going on too, which was cool, just to kind of see that active, Jewish celebration of this only remaining holy site for them, which was really, really powerful. But our main destination was to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the word for tomb, And it's interesting. It's kind of a controversial issue because there's a lot of people in different Christian traditions who, if you ever watched the Charlton Heston, the famous Charlton Heston Bible, documentary miniseries, it's very common to go to what they call the Garden Tomb. And I can't remember his name, but there was a Christian scholar, years ago, I think late 1800s, who claimed that he had discovered the true site of Jesus' tomb, and there was all this excitement about it and everything. But there's a lot of problems with it because it just doesn't line up. And the problem that a lot of people make is that sometimes it's easy to forget that the wall, when they talk about, Calvary, the site of Christ's crucifixion, and then his burial being outside the walls, you have to remember, though, that the walls have changed so many times in Jerusalem that it's hard to keep track of. And the current Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it seems strange because it's right in the middle of the city. And you're like, well, this couldn't be it because the Bible says it was outside the wall. Yeah, but that was 2,000 years ago, and the city has changed a lot. So what happened, though, the reason that we know actually the true site is where the Holy Sepulchre Church is because, funny enough, like I said earlier, for decades and then centuries, Christians would go and in small groups, go with your family, go with your church group, if you want to look at it that way, on a pilgrimage from the very beginning because it was important, right, to the site of Christ's sacrifice. And you go there and you pray, and, you go there and people come to visit, and the locals who know where this stuff happened to, they help them, like, yeah, this is where it happened. And the local Christian community, they go out there, they watch it because they're being hunted, they have to sneak out sometimes. And after a while, in an attempt to kind of crack down on Christians, the Emperor Hadrian, I think in the early 100s, less than 100 years after Jesus' life, he's getting sick and tired of all these Christians always congregating around this site. And they're trying to build the city up and everything, and, we gotta progress, right? So he wants to end them going there, so he actually commissions a giant temple to Venus to be built directly on top of this site to kind of end it once and for all. We're not going to have Christians coming here anymore, that's it. So, funny enough, about 200 years go by, Saint Helena, the Emperor Constantine's mother, converts to Christianity, and she's passionate about trying to get back to finding these sites, going back and going on pilgrimage to these holy sites. And she goes to Jerusalem, and she's investigating and researching. That's my daughter, by the way, in the background. You can hear her screaming. She goes to the site. She's like, you're trying to figure out, and she comes to find out, talking to the local Christians, where did it happen? Where was Jesus crucified? Where was he buried? And they indignantly point over to the Temple of Venus and say, under that giant monstrosity of a temple that the emperor built hundreds of years ago. And so the ironic thing is, the funny thing is, Hadrian tries to set out to sort of erase, Christian piety, the visiting of this site, and then ends up accidentally basically preserving the site for hundreds of years. So the new Christian Roman Empire, they come in, they level the Temple of Venus, they clear it all out, they excavate it, and they basically wipe that whole slate clean and discover underneath it the original sites of Mount Calvary, where Christ was crucified. They verify that that's where it was, and the tomb and by the garden right nearby, just as the Bible says, that he was buried in a garden tomb nearby that had been freshly cut, for Joseph of Arimathea, and he gives the tomb, for Jesus' usage instead. So all of this is all historical, it's all verified. The problem with the garden tomb, the one outside the current wall that a lot of tour groups go to and then they think is Jesus' real tomb, they have verified that tomb is from like the 8th century BC. Like it's an ancient tomb, not a freshly cut tomb around the time of Jesus, and it does not geographically fit. So anyway, that's just that background I think is important, because when you go in, it's you're just in a big church, and it's hard to kind of imagine what was there. But as you walk in, there's a stone slab right in front of you where Jesus' body was laying to be dressed for burial, and all of this is built around it to incorporate it into the structure of the church. So you go to the right, maybe like 10 or 15 yards, and there's this sharp staircase that goes up, about a flight or two, and then there's another level up there that's built over top of the top of Calvary. And there's an altar up there that's made of glass, and you can see through the glass floor of the floor rather is made of glass, and the whole surface underneath it, you can just see nothing but like rock face. So they've incorporated, so there's the rock face underneath the altar, and there's this beautiful crucifix that's roughly where Jesus' crucifix would have stood. And again, like at the Church of the Nativity, you can go in and you put your hand down and you can touch the rock. The rock where his blood dripped when he was crucified, and it's powerful. I can't describe it to you. And then what's neat is then you go downstairs directly underneath that, and there's a little area where it's cut into the stone where you can go in and look, and you can see this glass plate behind another little chapel on the wall where you can see behind it, and the whole rock face beneath that where you just were upstairs where the crucifix was is completely split all the way down to the bottom. Just like the gospel says how there were earthquakes and the rock split and everything. You can see it right there, preserved, and then you go back out of there, you go past where you walked in, and you go down, and then they're inside this big, newish church. I mean, the main structure is a couple hundred years old, but the main area you go and you visit is the tomb. And this is a tiny little chapel, basically, that is ancient, that goes back, almost to the time of Constantine. And then the rest of this whole church is built around that whole area, that whole campus or that whole site. But inside is this little church that was there first. That's the actual tomb itself. And when you walk in there, they only let you go in for a few seconds because there's a lot of people lining up to go in. You cannot take pictures because it is the holiest site in all of Christianity, you could argue. The site of the resurrection itself. And you walk in, my brother and I went in, it was silent, it was just the two of us. We had about 30 seconds in there to pray, and we came out and we were just blown away. Just like in the gospel, like, I have gone into Jesus Christ's tomb, and he is not there. He is risen. And so there's so much more to tell, but that was, I wanted to spend a little time on that because it was absolutely remarkable going to these places throughout Israel, and we wanted to go to so many more, like I said, but to connect in that way, to have it become not just some story you heard when you were growing up, but like, you've been there now. Like, I've been there. I've seen these places with my own eyes, and there's something happens to you when you're there that really makes it sink in. So that night we went back to the ship, we set sail, and went for our last stop, which was Egypt. And I can't do it justice, I don't want to skip through it too quick, but that was just so cool for a lot of biblical reasons, obviously. Joseph going to Egypt in the Old Testament, being sold into slavery, by his brothers, and then the Israelites going there, Moses, leading them out of Egypt, just all of that heritage, which is incredible. Not to mention Joseph, Jesus, and Mary going to Egypt, to hide from Herod. What was cool about that was, as we're looking at the pyramids, going through the Giza Plateau and everything through Cairo, and then out to see the pyramids and the Sphinx and everything, and our tour guide was telling us about the age of everything, and our minds were just blown, because it was like, those pyramids were already almost 3,000 years old when Jesus and Mary and Joseph saw them. Like, they're so old. The Sphinx, some estimates, they don't really even know. I think, some estimates say 10,000 years old. Like, it's very old. I could be wrong on that, but I think there's a lot of thought that it's a lot older than they used to think. So that was so cool. We went to the Egypt Museum in Cairo, got to see the pharaohs. There's a lot of the mummies, maybe even the pharaoh that Moses literally led the Israelites out of slavery from. Because, they don't know who exactly it was, but, Ramesses II, a lot of people think, and Amenhotep, and some other ones, King Tutankhamun's burial mask and everything was in there, and just all these really cool ancient artifacts and stuff. And our tour guide, though, he led us around with this, it was this really embarrassing thing. He had those little plastic, hand clappers, and, we'd go, he was flying through this museum, and, everywhere we go, he's like, and this right here is Tutankhamun's mask. Okay. And then we started dude, let me look at it for a second, I know you might see it every day, but I'm from, Pennsylvania. I want to see King Tut's mask for a minute, I want to look at this mummy, who's 3,000 years old or more. So, but anyways, even though we were kind of rushed through there, we had a lot of fun, and our tour group was amazing. We had to say goodbye to everybody. That night we stayed in this really beautiful hotel in Cairo. Had a very interesting night, because we hung out on the ship, we were with our tour group, but we also spent, my brother and I, a lot of time hanging out with this Northern Irish tour group. And they love to, drink and go to some of these shows and stuff, and we would drink not quite so much as them, but, we really made fast friends with them, and they kind of treated us like we were part of their tour group as well. So the last night in our hotel, we went down to the bar downstairs. And I'll never forget, it was just this weird scene as we're sitting in a 5-star Egyptian hotel bar at 2 in the morning with a guy named Frank, one of our friends from Northern Ireland, who I still, to this day, I don't even know what he was saying half the time, because he had this, it wasn't just an accent, he was also, drinking an awful lot, so it was very hard to understand. And Frank, we're sitting there talking to Frank, and Frank's talking about Jimmy Carter for some reason, and on the TV behind us is Saw 2, completely unedited. Uncensored, this vicious, horror movie. And it was this is an interesting sort of, we're drinking Egyptian beer and all this. Just a real memory, a real interesting way to cap off our Holy Land pilgrimage with this bizarre kind of, evening with Frank. And so then we went to the airport the next day, flew home to JFK again, and our parents picked us up, got to meet some of our friends from the tour as they were, going to their separate ways and stuff. And but anyways, it was such a awesome, incredible experience, life-changing experience. I'm so happy, and this is probably my longest episode yet, but it's well worth it, and there's so much more to be said about it. But I wanted to share with you, if you ever get a chance to go to the Holy Land, a lot of people worry about safety and security. That's a very legitimate concern, especially today, with a lot of stuff with ISIS and other security concerns. So it's, you should, think about that, consider that, but also, take heart, pray about it maybe, and really see if you think, with all, due respect for some of the safety concerns, if you really think that that's something that you want to pursue and go do, I really do recommend it. And some places, again, some places are safer than others. Israel's pretty safe because they really kind of have to, be in a lot of ways. And but to go to a lot of the sites of Christ's, life, I highly recommend it. And, there's a lot of tour groups, but I really recommend Steve Ray, Janet Ray. You can go to Steve's website. It's CatholicConvert.com. And he was, Southern Baptist, born and raised, and became a Catholic later in life, and really loves and treasures the Catholic faith. and will give you an incredible experience in the Holy Land, to be sure. So I couldn't recommend it higher. I recommend him higher, he and Janet. And I think the travel service they tend to use, or did at least back then, is Corporate Travel Services. I think they're out of Michigan. That's where Steve and Janet live. So yeah, check them out. Go to the website. He's always taking tour groups there. They go to other places too. Pilgrimages to Mexico, for Our Lady of Guadalupe, or Lourdes, or Rome, and different places. But the Holy Land is really their main gig, and I could not recommend it more highly. So that's it for the Gracious Guest show. If you enjoy this show, please share it with your friends. Get other people to check it out, and go over to iTunes if you get a chance. I keep throwing this out there, and I really want to encourage you. If you like the show, if you enjoy it, if it's uplifting, educational, interesting for you ever, and you could go over and give me a good rating on iTunes. I'd really appreciate it. It helps kind of get the word out about the show, and it will show up in more hits when people search for stuff, and it will really help kind of spread the Gracious Guest podcast. So I really appreciate that. I'm Mike Creevy. This is the Gracious Guest podcast, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.